Believe it or not, our weather here in the Mid-South is being controlled, at least partly, by what's happening thousands of miles away in the Pacific Ocean. This isn't science fiction. It's the power of El Niño and La Niña. Welcome, everyone, to The Current Temp. I am Joey Solopek, and this week we are literally talking about the current temp of the ocean water. Let me take a moment to thank my good friends at Lexus of Memphis, fantastic partners, great people, phenomenal vehicles. I mean, top notch. You're not going to do any better than the product you can get there and, of course, the service that you're going to get as well. So thank you to Lexus of Memphis. So what exactly is an El Niño and a La Niña? I'm sure you've heard those words before. You probably have said, okay, I've heard it enough now. I kind of get what it is, and maybe somebody sort of explained it to me. What in the world is going on? Well, let's start with this. A simple definition of El Niño, and we'll build outward. El Niño is basically warm water rising. If I had to put it in a nutshell, if I wanted you to remember one basic thing about El Niño, it's warm water rising. That's the root of this. Now, let's just dive in a little bit deeper. El Niño is what's known as a naturally occurring oceanic phenomenon. So in other words, some type of mysterious phenomenon that occurs in the ocean. We don't really understand why this happens, but it's an unusual and unpredictable warming of surface waters in the ocean near the equator. Now, you may be saying, why is that a big deal? Why does that matter? Why does it happen? Well, again, we're not really sure why it happens. There's a lot of mysteries involved in this, but we're going to talk more about why it's important. Ocean water, and I'm talking about across the entire planet, influences the atmosphere and the trade winds and the weather. That ripple effect is felt around the globe. I have spoken in front of thousands of school kids over 25 years about weather. We often talk about the water cycle. And of course, the earth is 75% water, and it dictates weather around the planet. And so something that is influential in that ecosystem is going to have an impact for everybody on earth. And of course, that means us right here in the Mid-South as well. So let's now take this a step further. Why in the world do we call this El Niño? Where did that name come from? Well, this pattern of ocean water was first recognized by fishermen off the coast of Peru. Okay, so think about the equator. You go a little further south. You've got fishermen out there, and they notice, wait a minute, this ocean water is warmer than normal. And it arrived around Christmas time. Okay, this is when it happens. When it does occur, it occurs around Christmas time. So these fishermen began calling it El Niño. Now, this is where it begins to get even more interesting. El Niño means the little boy. And when El Niño is capitalized, like you see it here on the screen, it means the Christ child. So you may have heard one of those two definitions, that it means little boy or Christ child, and so that became the name. So what exactly is happening with this El Niño pattern, this rising of warm water? All right, let's start the story right here. Let's start with normal conditions, normal oceanic conditions. And what you're looking at is a map of the equator. You can see North America and South America. And in normal conditions, you see the blue over here. You've got normal cool waters around this time of the year on that western side of South America. Okay, this is what we're focusing on right now because this will impact the whole globe. And you've got trade winds that happen along the equator, and those are pretty important as well. Now, let's go to, this is El Niño. Excuse me, this is normal. Now let's go to El Niño. So we're going to go from normal to El Niño. Now look at the difference here. Instead of the cooling water over here off the side of Peru, all of a sudden now that surface water is warm, okay? And it really changes things. It changes the way the water circulates. If you look up in North America, it shows for us in the North American area, a warmer winter. Of course, it has a ripple effect all over the place. But that's the basic premise of El Niño. And I know you're thinking, what's the big deal? It's happening way down here to the south. We're going to get to that in just a moment. Now, this unusual warm rising of water impacts ocean currents, which then impacts the weather around, the water, ocean water temperature impacts the weather above it. How fast water evaporates, whether it doesn't evaporate, it affects the speed and strength of ocean currents. It impacts the jet stream. We're going to get back to that because that's a big one. And so if you've got a phenomenon that impacts the jet stream, it absolutely is going to impact weather all over the globe. So, okay, that's a quick look at El Niño. So you've also heard of La Niña. So what in the world is La Niña? Well, La Niña, which also means little girl, so El Niño, boy, small boy, or Christ child, La Niña, little girl, is just that, the opposite of El Niño. And so you've got cooler water can then occur. So you've got normal, you've got El Niño, and then you can have La Niña, okay? So in La Niña's case, and I'm about to tell you why that's important now, you've got this massive upwelling of cooler water now. So instead of warm water rising, you've got cool water rising near Peru. And look how much it spreads out. It goes all the way over the equator, goes all the way up to North America. And that really begins to change things again. So you can see where it moves that warmer winter we saw with El Niño up in America. Now it pushes that west, and it means cooler and wetter weather to the north. And I know that's complicated. We're going to talk more about that in just a moment. All that to be said, you've got El Niño, warm water rising. You've got normal, and you've got La Niña, cool water rising. And all those things change ocean currents and weather patterns. All right. Now, let's talk about how that impacts us here in America. So we've talked about the globe. Then we're going to talk about America, the old US of A, and then we're going to zoom in on the Mid-South because that's where I live, and hopefully that will be interesting to some of you. All right. How does El Niño, let's start with El Niño, affect winter patterns, winter weather patterns, because it shows up around Christmas time. So how does it affect winter weather patterns? All right. As you can see, and I'll try to explain this to you, in an El Niño, which is what we're coming out of. We're going into a La Niña, okay, and we're going to talk about that. The jet stream that you're going to see is this big red arrow sinks further south because of El Niño. And the jet stream is critical. Think of the jet stream as sort of like a curtain, like, the big heavy curtain. Like if you've ever been to the Orpheum or a play, they got that giant curtain and it holds everything behind it back in. Well, that's what the jet stream is. Everything north of the jet stream is going to be cold air. So if the jet stream stays way north, cold air stays way north. If the jet stream dips down, it lets that cold air come back. It sort of is the gatekeeper of the cold air, and it's constantly moving and flowing. So in an El Niño winter, if sometime in the future somebody goes, well, we're going to have an El Niño winter, know to yourself, that means that jet stream is going to go way south. And in general, and we're talking generally, it means warmer conditions further north. I know that's blowing your mind, but let's look at the Mid-South right now. Slightly drier conditions and colder air moving south, okay? Now, what happens with a La Niña? Because that's what's occurring right now. We're transitioning from a pretty strong El Niño pattern, which has lasted a few years, and going into a La Niña. And keep in mind, none of this is predictable. You don't go straight from one to the other. You can go to normal. You could stay in normal for 20 years. You could have a weak La Niña. You could go to normal. You go back. It's just the strangest thing, but it does affect us. So what happens in a La Niña? This is what you want to know. This is the nuts and bolts because we're in a La Niña growing right now, and this is what it looks like will impact us in the U.S. going into this season. Okay, so check it out. Remember the jet stream that was red and really farther south? Well, in this one, they made it blue. And in a La Niña winter for North America, that jet stream stays further north. Well, remember I said it hems in the colder air. So in a La Niña winter, it's trying to make the southern U.S. warmer because the jet stream's going north. It holds the cold air back. And then it has impacts on moisture as well. We'll get to that here in just a moment. All right, now that I've shown you the overall jet stream, let's kind of break it down into boots on the ground. Hey, Joey, what's that mean for me? What's going to happen here? Let's start with the U.S., then we'll zoom in. So In a La Niña winter, if you ask me, and I get this question all the time, hey, how is that going to impact us this winter? Are we going to get snow? Are we not going to get snow? What are the probabilities? Remember this, all of weather forecasting is probabilities. There's a 70% chance of rain. That means 70% of us in the area are going to likely see some rain. There's a 100% chance of snow. We're going to see some snow. Everything is based on probabilities. And now we're talking about the future here. And so these are generic, general outlines. You're going to hear me say that a few times, okay? In a La Niña winter, in general, if you look at the map, you've got a drier, warmer south for winter. So if you're thinking you want a white Christmas, probably not going to happen in South Texas, South Louisiana. But it gets a little bit more interesting if you move north, okay? Because we're on the edge, the balancing point, the tipping point. It's wetter in the northeast. Wetter, I really enunciated that, didn't I? Wetter. It's wetter. It's wetter weather. Okay, we're getting off track here. Cooler in the far north. So you see the jet stream again has moved north in a La Niña. Jet stream, north La Niña. So what does that mean for the Mid-South? And I'm going to focus on Memphis. That's where we live. That's where, this is home. And it gets a little bit blurry. But here's the interesting thing for us going into this winter. We're on the edge of warmer, drier, and wetter conditions. Here's what that means to me. As you guys know, I'm in finance. I work with investments and portfolios. I've helped and talked to many of you. Hope to do so in the future. Hope we can help. But I've also spent a couple of decades in weather. And what this means is anything goes. So we can talk about the generalities of, generally speaking, this Mid-South is going to be a little bit more mild, a little drier than normal. We could still see a snowfall, especially when you take into effect, we're right on the edge of this predicted sort of forecast area. We could get more rain than usual. And here's something else to think about is that when we get a setup like this, and I'll be talking about this too in just a moment in the summary, when you're in a La Niña winter where it says we're going to be warmer than normal, well, that increases the chances that all of that cold air that's pent up behind that jet stream. Remember, I said it's like a curtain. I think of it kind of like a shower curtain, keeping the water in. Well, that can get pent up and sort of get a little bit more strengthened and pop out and give you a cold snap. We've experienced that with the polar vortex over the last many years. We've talked about that. We might do another breakdown of the polar vortex if we get into one of those situations. But it's like a tea kettle. So even though La Niña winters are milder and maybe a little drier, we're on the edge of moisture, and we could still see a snowfall is what I'm telling you. We're talking about generalities, but I still see the chance for that here in the Mid-South. All right, let's give you a recap. By the way, I was going to put the word recap up here, and then I thought to myself, where in the world did we get the word recap? Where did that word come from? I've said it for years. I'm going to recap this and give you a summary. We've all heard the word. You ready? It comes from the phrase recapitulate or re-explain or re-summarize, but it comes from recapitulate. I didn't realize that. I didn't really want to go into that whole definition, so I didn't put recap, but here I went and talked about it anyway, so I could have put recap. So let's stick with weather summary. All right. Going into this season, right now, we know through measurements, scientific measurements, Pacific waters are cooling. So we're talking about down near Peru where those fishermen knew the water was changing, so we're going from a rather strong El Niño, and we are going into a modest La Niña. So what does that mean locally for the Mid-South? Let's take Memphis and all the surrounding areas. Well, what that means is we're likely going to see the jet stream shift north, like we talked about. La Niña north, the jet stream is going to shift north. That also likely means fewer major rain events. That doesn't mean we're going to see no rain. Of course we will, but fewer than average. And so if you kind of, like most people, you gauge your weather from year to year, man, it sure was cold last year. Wonder if it will be this year. We may not see as much moisture. And of course, without moisture, you can't have snowfall. I'm a big snow fan, so I hope we still see that snowfall. And here's a couple of other things that are kind of interesting. It could mean a cooler than average early winter. So that means as we go into winter, November, December, January, colder than normal, right? Because we have normal average temperatures. We normally cool down into February, and then we start to warm back up. So we step down into February, and then the seasons change. The Earth is turning, we could see cooler than normal numbers earlier. All right. That could also mean a milder late winter. And so, as I said, normally we get colder towards January. If this were to follow normal La Niña generalities, we could do it reverse and be colder earlier and then get a little milder as we get closer, unless we get one of those cold snaps. So we're talking generalities with this whole thing. All right. It also means, per the map, that overall, the Mid-South will likely be drier than normal, especially the further south that you go, which means fewer big rain soakers, those big systems like, in fact, we just went through one today. And so depending on when you watch this week, we've had some big rain soakers come through here and just slowly rotate and soak the ground. And as I mentioned, it also increases the odds that we see some of that cold air spill over that jet stream and spill over the Mid-South. It's not going to spill over the jet stream because it's way up there, but just break out and give us a little bit of a cold snap. And that's part of what we call a stronger polar air intrusion. That really sounds super nerdy and techno speak, which I don't like. And what it basically means is you're setting up that cold air to spill over, like I mentioned, and give us kind of a, polar vortex situation. So, a couple of things to finish up with. The jet stream could also re-strengthen as the season goes on. Now, here's why that matters, because that could lead to more severe weather when we get into early spring of next year. So late winter, early spring, March, April. If that jet stream re-strengthens, that could give us a little bit more punch to storms that develop, and that means that tornado season could start a little early. It's a lot of stuff I just threw at you. You can rewind this and look at these points and keep in mind that doesn't mean we're going to have a massive storm system next year. It just means that, in general, if we follow La Niña guidelines, these are some of the things that data and history has pointed to over the years. All right, let's continue our weather summary. I think this is a great way to remember it if you get confused when this is all said and done and you're done watching, you're like, what did he say? El Niño, think of it as a thermostat. El Niño is on the warm side of the thermostat. La Niña is on the cool side of the thermostat. Both of these things are talking about how the water rises off the coast of Peru in South America and how that then impacts the entire globe. Now, what you're going to see next is a white screen because I forgot to put something on this slide. How about that? But I'm going to quickly get past it, and we're going to talk about agriculture first. How does El Niño and La Niña impact the world, real world impact? Let's start with crops. Depending on when we see the cool air, warm air, where we see the moisture, that's going to impact planting, harvesting. So that's one way El Niño and La Niña impact us. Also energy usage, how much you're paying for that MLGW bill. If we have a cold early winter, you're going to crank the heat up. If it stays milder, you don't need it as much. So that's another way this impacts us. And then you've got the possibility for more storms. If you have drier weather, you're not going to have storms. You got nothing to work with. There's no flour to bake the cake with. And so if it is a drier winter season, we're not going to have as many storms out there, although that could lead to severe weather in early spring. We'll be watching that. And of course, if it's a drier winter, we have been under drought conditions here in the Mid-South, and that's been a bit of an issue for us, as we all know, very dry conditions. And so it's been sort of an up and down roller coaster ride with rainfall this year. And so that's some of the things we'll be watching out for. All right. That was a lot, I know, but you've done great sitting here and listening to me. So let me give you a couple of closing thoughts. When you hear the word El Niño or La Niña, don't let it sound like techno-babble jargon or let it confuse you. Just know it is easily understandable. Let's think boy and girl. That's the easiest way to do it. Warm and cold. And it does then impact the Mid-South. And we just walked through how La Niña could impact us going into this weather center or this weather season. La Niña setting up, and it's a modest one. It's not super strong. Normally means drier and milder in the deep south and a little bit more rain in the northeast. And we're right in the middle of that right here in the Memphis area. So that's just one of the many ways that El Niño and La Niña are really a part of the pulse of the global weather heartbeat. And of course, those ripple effects affect us all. And it's just one more way that our planet, our miraculous, wonderful planet, is interconnected, complicated, and amazing, just like God designed it. And we have some fascinating things that we've been blessed with. And this is one of the things we'll be dealing with as we go into this season. I hope that was helpful. Speaking of helpful, if you ever need to get your car looked at, of course, they don't ever break down, but if you needed something checked, they're amazing at the Lexus dealership here in Memphis. Great men and women, as you've heard me say countless times. Thank you to Lexus. Friends, if you've got a comment, if you like what you saw, if you have a thought or an idea for a future one, email us. You can email us at thecurrenttemp@gmail.com. We would love for you to subscribe on our YouTube page. You can watch these whenever it's convenient for you. You can get them on Spotify, or you can watch them on my Facebook page, my Joey Solopek Facebook page. I post them generally about every Thursday, and if you just click on the videos tab, you should be able to go back and find any one of them. Friends, we are so glad that you've been here with us. I hope that I have El Niño'd and La Niña'd you to a higher level, and I hope that you have a great upcoming holiday season.